Hello and welcome to Inspiral Out Loud. We are sharing and exploring different ways where we can create a thriving future for all sentient beings. And today we're talking health. I had a chat with Mars a couple of weeks ago and we ended up actually having to sidestep this conversation because we realized there's actually quite a lot to cover. We've come back to the conversation today, which is looking at the current state of regulations and what's kind of been expected of people around the COVID-19 situation and where the sense or lack thereof is within that conversation. So, welcome Mars, how are you going?
Thank you. Very well. Yeah, keeping busy. How's yourself?
I'm very well. Okay, so we're now about 5 or 6 weeks into lockdown. We're in the middle of May, and it's just been weird. I've seen so many people wandering around with masks and gloves and making sure that they're enforcing 1.5 meters away from each other, and I'm seeing sanitizer everywhere, and it just feels like it's not okay, a lot of it. So I just thought we might have a look at all of these different things that people are doing and adhering to and seeing if there's actually any sense to it. So, I've been seeing so many people with masks. I haven't been wearing a mask. I haven't been coughing or sneezing, but also I actually just don't see the value in it personally. And to be honest, from what I've heard, it actually makes the situation so much worse. I mean, we are needing to be able to breathe in and out as far as part of our basic process of detoxification. And, you can imagine if people are using their masks all day, they're taking in so much less oxygen, and all of those exosomes and bacteria and so on that they're breathing out are just getting stuck in those masks and basically putrefying. And I'm seeing people with masks in their cars. It's not like they're even out and about with other people. So I'm just finding that extremely strange. And the same with people wearing gloves everywhere. I mean, that they're only as effective as if you change them as often as you wash your hands. Is what I've seen. They do absolutely nothing unless you are, say, working with chemicals or with contaminated blood or something like that, and you want to protect yourselves from them. They actually just don't stop you taking contaminants from one surface and putting them onto another. All they do is eliminate your nerves telling you what you're actually touching. So I'm just finding that whole thing with gloves to be very weird. Same thing with sanitizer, constantly killing off bacteria and viruses and things on your hand. Like, I know that we all are covered in bacteria. We're covered in hundreds or possibly thousands of viruses. I don't know the exact statistics, but I know that it's lots. And we need that constant contact with all of those different things in order to keep our immune systems activated. So I've heard that, potentially we're going to have some pretty big problems at the end of lockdown because there's a lot of people who haven't been exposed to any new viruses or bacteria for 6 weeks, and all of a sudden there's going to be an onslaught. So, that just feels like it's really not okay. And in fact, I was looking on a Macola website today, and one of his articles stated, a recent article from the last week, that 66% of new COVID-19 hospitalizations occurred amongst those that were distanced. So people are doing what they're telling us, but it's not making any difference. And likewise with, being forced to stay inside. So we're in Australia and it's not quite so militant here. But I know that in parts of Europe and the States that it is a lot more tightly enforced. And, there's a lot of people that just can't go out onto the street. And that lack of sunshine, that lack of fresh air, of oxygen, of sun rays creating vitamin D in the body, all of those things are affecting the body's immune system. And on top of that, if you're inside all of the time, you're constantly surrounded by EMFs, and those can be having a remarkable effect on the body. And if you're not getting a break from them, your system's just not getting a chance to repair itself. So, we've got all of these different things going on, and none of them seem to be helpful for us. And so, Mars, what's your take on all of these restrictions that are policed or otherwise?
Well, we do have a pretty different situation in Australia compared to some other parts of the world, as you've said. In some parts of the US, people are being reprimanded for even just being out in their own backyards or front yards, where they're just trying to get a bit of sunshine. And, in Australia, our rules are a bit more relaxed, although it's still pretty much a nanny state. We are allowed to go and walk around, but the problem there is, if you can't just lay in the sunshine, as you said, sunshine is absolutely vital for vitamin D production, and that is a absolute necessity for your health for varied reasons. It's not just vitamin D production. There's a whole lot of other processes that go on in the human body that are necessary. Part of it is melatonin production that regulates your cycles. There are a whole carry-on of important effects. If you can't lay down in the sun, we can walk around, but sure, but everyone's covered up. And you need most of your body exposed for a certain amount of time every day to get that vitamin D production at optimum levels. McCullough talks about that quite a lot. For those of you who don't know who Dr. McCullough is, I'll just briefly cover. He was a Western-trained professional doctor, and through his younger years when he was studying and training, he realized that there was something fundamentally wrong with the medical industry as a whole. And so he started taking the initiative to go and look for peer-reviewed independent studies of health, and found a very different story to what was taught in university. So he does have that background, so he's a qualified medical practitioner, but his position is drugs and surgery absolutely last in the chain of what to do for your health. So he has enormous resources on his website, so I'd recommend anyone who have any sort of condition or worry, I would say, look at him first and foremost. He's a very, very good resource, and he's actually got a whole team of doctors with a similar attitude of true holistic health. Now, when it comes to exposure to the sun, he's made it abundantly clear that if you want to get your vitamin D levels optimum, you basically need to strip down to your underwear and lay in the sun 5 minutes on each side minimum, and that will give you what you need. If you're in the sun all day and you've got clothing on, you're not getting your vitamin D.
Yeah.
As far as the masks and the scrubbing of hands with disinfectant and all of this, it's basically the polar opposite to what we do need to be doing to maintain our health. I liken it a little bit to a car engine in this respect. That is, if any component of the intake into an engine and the output of an engine is blocked up, you're going to have a bad running engine. There's no way to fix that. You simply have to have things flowing. Everything in the body, everything in life as a whole is about flow. Whether it's chemistry, electricity, energy, all of those things and more, you have to have a constant flow. And anytime things become stagnant or blocked up is where you get issues. And our breathing, does two things simultaneously. It provides an intake and it expels in the output. If you interrupt any of those with things like face masks, you're causing problems. You're causing stagnation of bacteria and viruses and bugs in the mesh of the mask itself. You're limiting your input of oxygen. You're breathing in your own, basically, exhaust. It's the equivalent of sticking an exhaust pipe in the intake of an engine. That's not going to work. Yeah. I mean, it might run, but certainly not nearly as well as it needs to. And it's a sort of a cumulative effect of all of these things that we're asked to do: social distancing, scrubbing your hands, putting on masks, all of these things, staying inside. All of these have a cumulative effect on our health. It's not just one thing or another, it's all of it combined. And EMFs are a big part of that. I mean, even if you don't have Wi-Fi in your own home, we have smart meters constantly bombarding us with EMFs. We've got power lines, we've got the neighbour's Wi-Fi, we've got people walking around with their mobile phones with the mobile data switched on all the time. And then we're stuck inside without enough sun, with no exercise, stagnant. A lot of people are sitting in front of their computers. All of this amounts to a reduction of our capacity to fight off any kind of viruses, toxins, etc. And as you've said, it's really important as well to actually be exposed to bacteria and viruses to some extent, just as a part of our natural course of the day, because without having that exposure, our immune systems don't function optimally as well. So it's a cumulative problem. And I think the other component of this, I mean, this is just talking about the physical, but it's also the psychological impact of all of this.
Yeah.
That is just, I think that in some ways it's almost worse than the physical. Setting up this kind of state where supposed experts, who clearly are not experts at everything, they're experts in what they're taught, but not necessarily in the truth of the matter, are dictating how we should manage our own affairs. And the psychology of that, I mean, we've talked a little bit in the past about social control and social conditioning to accept a nanny state more and more. And I see this as part of that, not being allowed to be in charge of our own affairs to the point where people get fined and possibly imprisoned, is just an obscenity, in my opinion. It's the complete opposite of where we as a species need to be heading, which is true sovereignty in our own right and the ability to make decisions for ourselves. We're adults and being treated by idiot children by states and organisations and institutions that have the arrogance to presume that they know everything there is to know about health. And how dare you go against the grain of that under penalty?
Yeah, absolutely. And it feels like the punishment doesn't fit the crime. And looking at the nature of viruses, it seems absolutely ludicrous that we've got this extent of constrictions happening that just don't seem to relate to what a viral situation would be. And in another McCullough article that I was looking at from the 12th of May, so very recent, was saying that 99% of deaths had pre-existing conditions. So, and we've known for quite a while that the testing's been grossly inaccurate, and the testing procedures have been varying from country to country. So, even that data just doesn't make sense.
The studies for that have popped up everywhere. It's not unique to one place or another. It seems to be a very consistent problem that the misdiagnosis of the alleged pandemic, they're not painting us an honest picture, and you got to ask yourself why are they doing that?
Yeah. And also, most of those deaths, the most prevalent causes of death, this was amongst 19 to 45 or 50-year-olds, so the younger portion of the population, was obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and insulin resistance. And we're pretty big on food as medicine. So, we know that so much of that is caused by diet. And I was looking into this a little bit today, and apparently, most of the dietary guidelines, they're hugely influenced by multinational food and beverage corporations that, they've got profit as their bottom dollar. So to me, we've got a dietary issue that's causing a whole lot of unwellness, that is being blamed on this virus, and it just seems like the correlation isn't very strong. Now, I was looking into how potentially technology, and we'll be looking at this a lot more in other episodes, but just briefly looking at areas that are hardest hit by so-called COVID-19 cases. And as you've mentioned in another episode, Mars, that there is a correlation between those areas and the areas that have had a recent 5G rollout. And it's not just in relation to man-made advances in technology. So you've mentioned before the Spanish flu that came out, but even before man-made technology, I just found this out. In 1728, a flu pandemic broke out after 150 years of having no pandemics. And that was just 1 year after the sun started increasing in activity. So it had had a solar flare. And so that pandemic broke out at the same time all over the globe. And this is 1728. We didn't have the level of international travel, and certainly not the speed that we have these days. So that idea that a virus is something that's passed on from one person to the other like a bacteria doesn't quite make sense. And I've heard doctors saying that, a virus isn't actually a thing that can be passed on, that it is an excretion that happens when the body's reacting to stress. And looking at that kind of information, then that kind of makes sense. And there was another one that happened in 1889 that was something called the emergence of power line harmonics, which actually changed the Earth's magnetic field. And there was another flu pandemic there. And there's a book by someone called Furstenberg. I haven't actually read this book, but after looking at this article, I'm going to follow up on that. So I will put the link to that book in the comments under this video. Mars, have you got anything to add to that idea around how technology might be influencing this briefly? I know we're going to have another whole topic on this later on down the track, because it is a big topic. But yeah.
I didn't know about the 1700s issue with the solar flare that you mentioned. That's actually very interesting. I am sure that if that was posed to anyone in the sanctioned academia, they would argue that it's a bunch of poppycock. And the reason they would argue that is the same reason why they argue that there's nothing dangerous about Wi-Fi, mobile phones, etc. And it's to do with how they determine what is safe and what is not. And their paradigm is this. They measure the testing by energy levels in terms of transference of electrical energy into heat energy in the body. And that's all well and good for example, a microwave oven, because it's designed to heat up water molecules within the foods that we eat, and that there's a direct correlation there. is when they're applying that to low-level amplitude or strength of electromagnetic frequencies, that's all they're looking at. That's what their testing is doing, is just checking how much it's heating up cells and in what proximity to the cell the antenna is heating up the cell. But what we do know is that that is not the sum total of what goes on within the body, because cells in the body are dependent on electrical charge, and there's a balance of negative and positive charges within each cell. And anytime you disrupt that balance of charges, you get problems in cells. And unfortunately, what happens with specific frequencies of electromagnetic radiation is even very small amplitude or energy level frequencies disrupt that charge. It doesn't take a lot of energy, electrical energy, to do that. And they're not looking at that. So this is why they will tell you it's perfectly safe and there's nothing to see here, move along. They're only looking at a small part of the big picture of the interference with these frequencies on the body. And it doesn't matter whether they're man-made or naturally occurring. They cause problems.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the predominant pre-existing conditions earlier, diabetes, heart disease, etc. The funny thing is that when you look at the information that is coming out by independent studies on health, you find that there's a common theme amongst all of those, and that is dominantly, although not exclusively, tied in with simple sugars and carbohydrates from flour, wheat, plain rice, and most of those starchy kinds of foods that we consume in large quantities are simple carbohydrates, and they are directly linked with diabetes. I mean, doctors will tell you don't eat sugar if you're diabetic. Why?
Yeah.
Because sugar is a simple carbohydrate that exacerbates the whole condition. But what the research is coming out, that heart disease is also related to excessive consumption of those food groups. And it just so happens that if you look at the standard diet in some of the countries that are the hardest hit by this supposed pandemic, you'll find that they have a huge amount of sugar, flour, and those sort of products as a core component of their diet. And it's interesting, I remember from when I was in school, we had in health education, we were presented with the food pyramid, and it's turned out that
it's upside down.
Still is being taught. Exactly, it's upside down, and it's still being taught. And the largest food group that we're supposed to eat, which is supposedly healthy, is breads and flour and all of those products that we really should have a very minimal amount of, if at all.
Yeah.
So it's really no surprise that there's it is a pandemic of disease in America in particular. And, all we have to do is look at their diet. I know from personal experience, when I was younger, I routinely got bronchitis and colds. And so that went all the way up into my 30s. And around the time of my 30s, I dramatically reduced my consumption of those breads and so on. But particularly, I stopped eating dairy because I have a reaction to it. And I don't think I've been sick in perhaps 6 or 7 years. Whereas when I was in my 20s and mid-30s, I would get sick at least once a year from a cold. I would never get the flu. I don't think I've ever had the flu in my life. But I did have consistency of getting sick. And it wasn't even necessarily during the winter either. It wasn't even during the summer periods. And I've known from personal experience that diet has a huge part to play in our general health and whether we get sick or not.
Yeah, same. Like, as you know, I've had to be so vigilant with my diet for 25 years. And when I first started on the path of health as far as food goes, I was actually working for a naturopath about 25 years ago up in Brisbane, and I was drinking those flavoured milk drinks. And at that time, I had severe headaches and nausea and all sorts of things. And I'd actually gone to the doctor about it. And I asked him, is it possible that I'm allergic to something? And he said, oh, I don't know, maybe chocolate or oranges. Here, have some codeine and come back in 2 weeks if you've still got a headache. And I was like, I've had this headache for 2 or 3 years. And only a day or two after that, it just happened that the naturopath saw me drinking this drink. And she said, oh, let me look at your eyes. And she did, 5-second iridology screening of my eyes. And she said, you should not be drinking milk. And so I didn't drink milk for 3 or 4 days. And immediately my headaches went down to about 20%. And that was just one tiny little tweak. And these days, my diet is just ridiculous as far as just needing to manage it. And I go into a supermarket and 99.9% of what is in there is poisonous for my body. And yet people fill their trolleys with this shit. It just makes me wild. But I had a look at a look into those food guidelines, like those dietary guidelines today, because they're just not right. And now this is in America, but I would imagine that it relates very closely to the guidelines here. So apparently the Guidelines Advisory Committee, so these are the guys that tell us, how much of everything we need, our vitamins, our food, what's good for us, what's not, is tied to the International Life Sciences Institute, or the ILSI. And that is a not-for-profit organisation that was started by Coca-Cola 40 years ago. And apparently the ILSI is ingrained in health panels across Europe and the UN. And apparently 75% of people who are formulating dietary guidelines in the US just happen to be tied to food and beverage corporations. And 55% are tied to the ILSI. And that includes people from Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, McDonald's, Monsanto. These are the people that are deciding what our dietary guidelines should be. So what do you think they're going to be promoting? Fresh fruit and vegetables, or GMO corn and sugar and wheat and soy? And the other little side note on that is that actually many of those food company executives, they don't eat their own products due to the health implications.
No surprises there.
No surprises, but
groups.
Yeah.
So you find out pretty quickly that they're very well aware of the health risks of all of these things, including the telecommunications industry that knew from get-go that Wi-Fi was going to be a significant health problem. They simply cherry-picked the data that they provided in their mandatory health reports and went on with this business as usual, but they knew full well it was dangerous. And it's the same old pattern. They know exactly what's going on. It's basically criminal. I mean, there's no other way to put it. It is criminal behaviour. It's willful harm.
Yeah, absolutely. Crimes against humanity. And just going back to that food as well. So all of those GMO foods, they have, so we were talking about what I'm calling the triple whammy of fluoride, glyphosates and aluminium. And I heard Sacha Stone talking about this recently, and he was referring to Dr. Klinghardt, who's just an incredible soul. I'll put a link to him as well in the comment section. But so glyphosates, that's the active ingredient in Roundup. Our favourites from Monsanto that are sprayed on non-organic crops. And so a lot of those GMO foods, which are in a lot of those processed and takeaway foods, your sugar, corn, soy, wheat, they're absolutely full of this stuff. And it kills the beneficial bacteria in the gut. And as we know, the gut is just the first point of call for our health. So if you kill your gut, you kill the rest of it, basically. So you've got glyphosates, and we've also got aluminium, which you get in non-organic baking powder and processed cheeses, pickled vegetables, cake mixes, cookware, aluminium foil. Like, we're getting all of these different things. And then fluoride in the water and in our toothpaste. And those three elements together are basically attacking our pineal gland. Now, I knew that fluoride was calcifying the pineal gland, but apparently the other two connected to those, they just, like I said, it's a triple whammy. And we need our pineal glands. They're our friends, because our pineal glands are connecting us to spirit. So we're going to have a quick chat about what we can do regarding that shortly. But look, that's all the nasty stuff out of the way. Have you got anything to add to the nasty stuff, Maz?
Where do I start? When do I end?
I know that you could go on about this thing for days and weeks and years, but maybe 2 minutes, and then we'll move on to the fun stuff.
I'll try and limit my frustration. All right, let's start with this fluoride. So, basic chemistry. When you have vital elements within the body, if you look on the periodic table, you'll see there are groups of types of elements. And fluoride is closely connected with chlorine and calcium and magnesium, if my memory serves me well. And depending on what's going on with your body chemistry, if you're deficient in something the body needs, for example, calcium, it'll find the next best thing. And there's a sort of a hierarchy of these interchangeable elements. And things like fluoride, well, they have a nasty tendency to displace calcium. Mm-hmm. And what that means is that calcium then shifts around and goes to places where it perhaps shouldn't be, because you've also got a problem with magnesium deficiency. And magnesium and calcium are very strongly connected. You have to have those in perfect balance. And your body generally does that very well until you have an introduction of things like fluoride. That also has an impact with, as you said, your pineal gland, which is not just for regulation of melatonin and other things, but as you said, it is if there was the seat to the soul as it's been put by the ancients, that would be it. And that also has a role to play in hormone production and a few other odds and ends. That's basically the gist of fluoride. Aluminium is a massive problem. It's connected with mental diseases. It's connected with blocking of the arteries, because what happens with aluminium, you'll notice antiperspirants, which are designed basically to block your sweat glands. The active ingredient, aluminium, when it's in various types of salts, becomes quite sticky. That's why it works as an antiperspirant, and that gets into various parts of the body and remains sticky there. And as we've talked about earlier, the body needs constant flow, and as soon as you create blockages, you get problems. Glyphosate is, as you've said, it knocks out the gut bacteria, and that's an important part of our immune system. Those bacteria are there for a reason, even to the point where doctors are talking about fecal transplants for people that do have chronic illnesses, because they've realized that if you lack certain bacteria, your body doesn't fight things off very well. So that's becoming somewhat mainstream knowledge, which is good. At least they're making some advances. But of course, glyphosate is also a carcinogen. And all of these things are a cumulative problem largely. It's not like you eat things and you're going to drop dead. It's going to be a gradual decline in your overall health, and then one day you wake up with ailments in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, etc., and they'll say, oh, that's just part of getting old. It's perfectly normal. Your eyesight goes, your hearing goes, and all of these things disappear when you get older. Well, sorry, but that's just absolute bunk, because
Yeah.
if that were true, then every single person by the time they hit 80 or 90 will be deaf and blind, according to that theory. When in fact, many people live well beyond that without any hearing loss, without any eyesight loss. So the exceptions actually prove the rule is wrong. What's really going on, in my opinion, is that we are just bombarded day to day with small doses of all these toxins and poisons that build up cumulatively over decades and result in all these debilitating conditions and chronic diseases in later years.
Agreed. Agreed. Yeah, and we see so many incredible people in their 80s and 90s that still have the spirit and the bounce of a 30-year-old. There's no reason why we all shouldn't have that. So let's look at how we can have that. How can we make things better?